Hey everybody, welcome back to another map of the day. And the map we're looking at right now is called Quarry. Now, this is not to be confused with that hidden cup map that looks like a Pokeball. That is something completely different. What we're looking at right here is a different version of Quarry, in which most of the wood on the map is on the border, which leaves the middle of the map very open. So players start off in this pit area, and there's quite a bit more gold and stone on the map than you'd typically find on a normal kind of map. And then in addition to that, we have a special feature that was intended to have on this map where there are a bunch of Gaia petards around the map, which are enclosed in these rocks. So if we take a look at the code for those rocks, so the stone mines, which are supposed to be surrounding these petards, have a resource delta of negative 340. And since stone mines usually contain 350 resources, all it takes is a villager to come over and mine 10 stone from one of these mines to get the petard out. So this is one of those maps that I had made a long time ago, and it's a good opportunity now to refurbish it for the definitive edition, now that we have some more features available to us, and for me personally, a bit more knowledge about scripting than I had way back when. So let's start off with the layout of the map, and we'll get to the interesting part later with how we're going to change how the petards work, because that's going to be pretty interesting. So let's start off with the way this elevation works. So I said at the beginning that it was intentional to have players start off in this pit, but if you'll notice, the middle elevation slopes downward before it gets to these trees on the side. And that actually wasn't a intentional feature. I just didn't know how to get it the way I wanted way back when. So let's see how we can do that. So if we're looking at the land generation section, we can see that the base terrain of the map is Palm Desert, and then all of the land in the middle is being taken up by the player lands, which have 5% borders on all sides. So we can pretty much see that here, is that the Palm Desert border is on the outside, and then the rest of the land on the map is comprised by the player lands. And then in the elevation section, we are elevating the terrain type of the player lands to make sure players start in a pit. Since elevations normally avoid the player's start locations, that's what's creating the pit area, because the elevation 3 is not allowed to create around the players. So in order to get a homogeneous elevation between the border, which is made of wood, what we're going to do is we're going to create a neutral land, which is the same terrain type as the player lands. So these are going to have relatively the same properties, with the exception that the player lands are going to take up 0% of the land, and then this neutral land is going to be in land position 50-50 and at base elevation 3. So if we take a look at what that does, is that we can see that now we have the border of the map, which is wood, at the same elevation as the middle terrain, so that the middle terrain is not sloping down before the wood border starts. And now I want to make the base size a little bit bigger here. So instead of 9, we'll make it 15. And then we can basically have the elevation the way we had it before, where the elevation that we create in the dirt area is making the pit around the player lands, just like we see here. And then the wooden border and the rest of the map are going to start out at the same elevation before anything else happens. So that's a nice thing to know. And with respect to the rest of the elevation section, we can modify it slightly since scaling by groups and scaling by size doesn't work the same way in the original game as it does in the definitive edition. So instead of scaling by groups here, we'll scale by size. Do the same thing for here. And then for this piece of elevation here, this is supposed to create a little bit of elevation 4 on top of the dirt in the middle. So we'll adjust that slightly to say we'll generate 1,250 tiles set scaled by size, and then the number of clumps is going to be different for each map size. So that takes care of that. And then we can move on to the terrain section next. So the first thing we're doing is creating some palm desert on top of dirt. There's no other terrains to avoid at this point, so we'll get rid of this spacing to other terrain types. The shallows here, I will change that to DLC new shallow, and I will reduce the land percent a little bit, reduce the clumps a little. And then instead of using height limits to make this terrain only spawn on elevation 3, that's really not the best way to do it. If we can see, let's look around here. We can see that can sometimes still lead to the shallows spawning on the slope of a hill, which is something I would prefer to avoid. So the best way to do that is say set flat terrain only, and then spacing to other terrain types is going to be 1. So now that we have that set flat terrain only, we can be sure that the shallows will never be spawning on the slope of a hill, and we can see that it's now no longer limited to a specific height limits. See, this is generated on elevation 3, and we can see that this bit is generated on elevation 4. So while we're here, let's decorate the forest a little bit. So we will put some DLC dragon forest on top of palm desert. We'll have 8%, 100 clumps, set scale by groups, terrain, mask 2. And then in addition to that, we'll say 100% more clumps, terrain mask 1. So that decorates the forest a little bit. And then instead of generating this road ivy, we'll change it to DLC desert gravel and put a terrain mask of 1 on it. So that looks nice. And then with regard to the rest of the terrain section, so these little bits here, creating dirt 2 on top of dirt and creating rocks on top of dirt 2, is supposed to be what's going to keep the petards in the right spot. So if we look at here, we're spawning a little bit of dirt 2 on the dirt, and then there's going to be a patch of rock terrain, which is at least 1 tile width of dirt 2, so we can place the petard here and place stone mines all around. Now, one thing to know is that if you're trying to space things very evenly across the map, relying on terrains to do that is not really the best option if you only have a few clumps. Because terrains, we don't really have a lot of control over how those distribute across the map. So we're going to get rid of that in the update we're doing because we're going to get a better weight. So what we're looking at here is the way the map looks now, and the last thing I want to do is I actually want the pits to be gravel terrain, and we'll see how we do that. So instead of at the top everything being dirt as the base terrain, we'll say DLC desert gravel is the base terrain, and then create terrain dirt. On top of the DLC desert gravel, 100%, many clumps, and then we'll set avoid player start areas. So now players start off in these gravelly pits, and that's just a nice looking effect. So since the terrain generation section of the map is pretty much done, we can get straight to it with how we're generating the petards. But first let's go back to the old version to explain a bit more in detail why it's important to change it. So the way we have it now has two problems that I can see. So the first one is one that I already talked about, is that if we're trying to space things out very evenly across the map, it's very difficult to do that if we're just relying on terrains, because we don't have much control over how those evenly distribute across the map. And then the other reason is that since the petards are just a normal Gaia unit, the normal Gaia unit will convert to the first player who happens to scout it. And that can be unfair if we combine it with the first issue, knowing that they don't necessarily spawn very evenly in the first place. So in the update we're doing, let's keep those things in mind and see what we can do to make it a bit more balanced. So we have our Gaia petards over here, and we'll focus on those right now. So right now we're placing 100 objects, and we no longer have rock terrain on our map, so we're going to have to find a different way. So the first thing I'll do is say min distance to players is going to be 20, and then temp min distance placement is going to be 25. We'll have them avoid the forests on the map by a little bit, and let's go back here. And these should be generating pretty evenly now. Because we are relying on objects to evenly distribute things across the map instead of relying on terrains. So that helps us with the first issue. And then the next issue with the petards is that they're still just normal Gaia units, which means they convert to the first player who scouts them, and that can be a bit luck-based and doesn't really require any investment from the player. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it as a unconvertible Gaia object. So players can't capture it immediately upon scouting it. And the way we're going to make the petard convertible to a player with some investment required is something pretty interesting. So let's go up to the top, because we're going to need some constants. We're going to need constant saboteur, and that's going to be 706. So if you don't know this already, a saboteur is basically a unit that looks very similar to a petard, but it's a different unit. And what we're going to do is we're going to use some RMS effects here. So we're going to say effect amount Gaia set attribute saboteur attr hit points. We're going to set the hit points to 1, and then we're going to set the saboteur's dead ID to object 440. So object 440 is a normal petard. So if we, instead of generating petards down here, we generated saboteurs, let's go into a normal game and see what we have for us. So now that we're in a normal game, we can see that we're able to walk up to the saboteur unit without converting it right away, because we set the unconvertible attribute to that Gaia unit. Let's notice some other things here. So if we select a villager, we can't attack a unconvertible Gaia unit with a villager. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind here. But we are allowed to attack it with the scout, and since it only has 1 HP, it dies in a single hit. Now, once it dies, we can notice that the dead unit, which was a petard, is actually convertible, and then also notice that the saboteur dealt damage to the units that were surrounding it. But for now, this is a pretty good step in the right direction to see that we are able to obtain a convertible unit from an unconvertible one by killing it. So let's keep working and let's see what we can do to make this situation a bit better. So we have 2 problems right now that we are trying to fix, and we're going to try and kill 2 birds with 1 stone here. So instead of using the saboteur as the base unit, we're going to try to use a unit as a base that a villager is capable of attacking, and then upgrade it into a saboteur. So what we're going to do is effect amount Gaia upgrade unit, and we're going to upgrade a goat into a saboteur. The argument is going to be 0, and we're going to, well, this is supposed to be DLC goat. And then the object section, instead of creating saboteurs, we'll create goats, and we'll see how that changes things. So now we are approaching this saboteur, and we notice that we're still not able to convert it, which is good. And then also notice that we're able to task a villager to the saboteur, since we upgraded it from a goat, which is something that a villager can be tasked to. And then also notice that the saboteur no longer did damage to the surrounding units, and that seems to be something that's hard-coded to the livestock class, which a goat is, that it can't do damage to other units. So that's cool. Now, I want to call that good for now. We can come back to that part later, but what I want to do now is focus on how to create the rock objects that are going to surround those petards. So first we're going to need some placeholders. So an on-grid placeholder is going to be 278, an off-grid placeholder is going to be 647, and then we have this rock stone, which is 839, and we'll see what that does. So after we create the saboteurs, which are actually goats, we'll give these an actor area of 1 actor area, radius of 0. We will then create, instead of these stone mines here, we will create off-grid objects. We'll say very many of them. We'll say actor area to place in is going to be number 1. It's going to have an actor area itself, which is actor area 2 with a radius of 1. And then in actor area 2, we will place rock, stone. Number of objects is going to be very many, and we're going to say actor area to place in. It's going to be 2. This has going to have an actor area of 3 with a radius of 3. So let's restart and see what we have for us here. So now we have enclosed this petard unit in all these rocks. And these may look like normal rocks, but they are not quite. You'll notice that they contain a certain amount of stone in them. And what we can do with that is that we can task a villager to it. And before a villager is able to access any stone, it has to pick away at the HP. Now, this is a good object to have in a case like this because we don't necessarily want to fool players into thinking that there's a substantial amount of stone if these all look like stone mines, for example. So this is a differentiable object, and we can modify both the hit points of this object and its resource storage value to control how long it's going to take the villager to get through to here. So up at the top, we will do some more effect amounts. So instead of affecting the saboteur, we'll affect the rock stone. Set its hit points to 100, and we'll set ATTR storage value to be 1. Now, this object has to have at least 1 stone in it in order for a villager to be tasked to it. So that's one thing to know about using an object like this. So now we can see that the effects that we put in place are here. So the stone only has 100 HP as opposed to 200, so the villager is able to get to it faster. It only has 1 storage of stone, so that the villager can get through that part easy also. So that effect is pretty nice looking. So at this point, we might be feeling pretty satisfied with what we've been able to achieve so far. But just to cover our bases, let's just say, for example, that, or instead of having a scout around, we had an archer. So we can see that these rocks would prevent normal units from getting to the petard in order to capture it without breaking through here. But nothing right now is stopping an archer unit from attacking the saboteur unit from a distance in order to capture it without breaking through these rocks here. So that's kind of a thing that we'd prefer to avoid if we can. And luckily, with a few more RMS effects, that is quite possible. So what we're going to do is a couple things. So right away, we are going to not set its hit points to 1. We're going to leave the default hit points at 100. And what we're going to do instead is we're going to affect its armors. So ETTR armor. We're going to do 2 classes of armor, which is going to be melee and pierce armor. So melee and pierce armor are class 3 and class 4. So if we did 56 times 3, so that would be pierce armor. If we wanted to give it 100 pierce armor, we set its armor value to 868. And 256 times 4 plus 100 is 1124. And that would set its melee armor to be 100. So if we do that and we say ATTR shown melee armor and shown pierce armor are both going to be 100. So that's going to make it a very tough unit, which is going to be very hard to kill. And to go even a step further, we can give it a very high regeneration rate. So if we go into randommap.def, we see we have an attribute here for regeneration rate. So we can use that if we want to make it basically invincible to normal attacks. So we can set the attribute of the regeneration rate of the saboteur to be a very big number, say 30,000, and we'll see what we have for us.
Ready.
So we can see now that the saboteur has 100 melee and pierce armor, but it's not quite regenerating very fast, and that has to do with the fact that since a saboteur is normally a hero unit has its own regeneration rate that overrides whatever regeneration rate that we put here. So in order to have this modified regeneration rate, we have to remove the saboteur's hero status. So ATTR hero status is going to have to be 0 so that this increased regeneration rate can take effect. So we can see that the saboteur's regeneration rate is now quite a bit higher, making it pretty much impossible to kill it with these groups of archers here. But now we still have the issue of we still want it to be able to be killed by a villager. So what we're going to do to fix that problem is we're simply going to increase the attack of the villager, which is going to be attacking that saboteur. So if we get a couple more constants here, so we have a shepherd, 2 shepherd constants here. So one is the male villager shepherd and one is the female villager shepherd. And then to increase their attack, we will simply do an effect amount, well, add attribute, shepherd 1, ATTR attack, and we want to add 100 melee attack. So melee attack is class 4, so we have 256 times 4 plus 100, so 1124 melee attack for shepherd number 1, and the same goes for shepherd number 2. Why not just make it 200? Okay, so now we're in this situation, and we have said that the saboteur is going to be very strong, so it's going to be resisting normal attacks here. And if we wait for our villager to get through here, we can see that if we task the villager to get the petard, the shepherd now has a lot more attack, and it's able to kill the saboteur in a single hit. Thus, we are able to convert it with the villager, but not sort of lame it with these archers. So that's nice. But next, it would be a fair question to ask is whether giving an extra 200 attack to villagers is going to affect the game in a very substantial way? And the answer is not really, because if we task the villager to do anything else besides get a sheep, or in this case, the saboteur, it's no longer a shepherd. So we can see that it has plus 200 attack now, but if we task it to a tree, it's no longer a shepherd, it's a lumberjack, and therefore it has only 3 attack, and the extra attack does not apply. The same would go for if we try to attack an enemy. When you try to attack enemy units, villagers are just generic villagers, they're not shepherds, and so the extra 200 attack will not apply. So yeah, that's pretty much the way we get around the problem of preventing these units from being lamed by range units, while still allowing villagers to be tasked to them to convert them over for use for players. So just looking around here, you're going to notice this little issue here where the stone mines aren't able to spawn on these shallows, and I knew these on-grid placeholders were important, so this is what we have to use them for. So instead of creating just rock stone, we'll create these on-grid placeholders and have the rock stone created by the second object. And then since on-grid placeholder is a dead fish trap, we will set its storage value to 0. So it goes away right away. So we no longer have that issue over here. Oh, but actually, it put a stone right on top of the petard. So we will make sure that these avoid actor area number 1, which is right here, so that they won't spawn on top of the petard.
Ready.
That's a bit better. So beyond that, there's not much else left to the map. I'll just replace the objects section with a couple extra tweaks. Nothing super special, just adding a couple of extra restrictions. For example, avoiding actor area 3, so all other objects can stay away from these petards and not crowd it too much. And so now we have our finished map. And the end result is pretty satisfying in the sense that we used a pretty interesting method in order to get all these Gaia petards to be pretty evenly distributed throughout the map, and also removed a lot of the luck factor that would be involved with obtaining them. So hopefully you guys have learned something in this video. So thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you next time.